He was the golden boy of soft rock, the man whose voice defined the soundtracks of the 80s and brought feel-good energy to America's living rooms with hits like Footloose, Danger Zone, and I'm All Right. To the world, Kenny Loggins was the soundtrack. To summer, chill, likable, and unthreatening. But behind those California smiles and breezy choruses lurked something much darker. A fiercely competitive artist obsessed with his place in the pop hierarchy. A man who studied every chart, every award, and every praise directed at someone else with simmering envy. While fans swayed to his mellow ballads, Loggins was raging on the inside, privately stewing over peers who dared to challenge his reign as the king of yacht rock. He smiled on stage but seethed backstage. Beneath the surface, he harbored deep resentments, forged bitter rivalries, and even went to war with collaborators he once called friends. From rising stars who won too fast to former allies who stole his thunder, Kenny Loggins kept a list. And now, decades later, that list has finally come to light. These aren't just artistic disagreements or fleeting industry drama. These were personal vendettas that shaped the trajectory of his career and stained the glossy image he worked so hard to perfect. You thought Kenny Loggins was all smooth vibes and good times? Think again. The 6 musicians you're about to hear about weren't just competition, they were threats to a legacy Loggins was prepared to protect at all costs. And once you know the names, you'll never hear those soft rock anthems the same way again. Long before the world dubbed him the king of the movie soundtrack, Kenny Loggins had already carved out a throne in the soft rock kingdom. His mellow voice and sun-drenched melodies masking a firestorm of ambition beneath the surface. He wasn't just chasing success, he was defending an empire. Every chorus, every lyric, every carefully crafted harmony was a brick in the fortress he built around his musical identity. But what fans didn't see, and what the industry insiders only whispered about, was that Loggins wasn't just writing hits. He was quietly measuring himself against every artist who dared enter his sonic territory. To many, soft rock was a genre of smiles and good vibes. To Loggins, it was a battlefield camouflaged by Hawaiian shirts and acoustic guitars. Behind closed studio doors and beneath the gloss of Billboard features, Loggins was hyper-aware of who was rising, who was getting the Grammy nods, and who was being called the voice of a generation. He wasn't satisfied with just hits. He wanted reverence, control, and to be remembered not as a passing wave, but as the tide itself. But with every year that passed, newcomers and veterans alike chipped away at his carefully guarded reign. Some did it unknowingly. Others, he believed, knew exactly what they were doing. From collaborators who became stars in their own right to competitors who snatched roles, awards, and audiences from under his nose, Loggins found himself surrounded not by allies, but by threats in disguise. And as he fought to maintain his image, as the genre's smoothest operator, he became entangled in a web of jealousy, rivalry, and emotional warfare that would define his relationships and, ultimately, expose the darker truths behind the yacht rock dream. The king was under siege, and he was not going down without a silent, seething fight. Kenny Loggins had spent more than a decade crafting his image, climbing the ladder with sweat equity, radio hits, and strategic collaborations. So when a relatively unknown Texan named Christopher Cross came out of nowhere and swept the 1981 Grammy Awards with his debut album, Loggins didn't just raise an eyebrow. He erupted with disbelief. Watching from home, surrounded by platinum records he'd earned over years of relentless touring and creative reinvention, Loggins saw Cross collect not 1, not 2, but 5 Grammys, including the coveted Album of the Year. The industry cheered. A new golden boy, but for Loggins, it felt like a slap across the face. According to insiders, he immediately phoned his manager in a fury, reportedly growling, "One album and he gets everything I've been working toward for a decade. This business has no memory." That night wasn't just a celebration of Cross. It was a declaration that the game had changed, and Loggins wasn't the chosen one anymore. What cut the deepest wasn't Cross's smooth vocals or compositional talent, but the timing. Loggins had just come into his own after years of playing second fiddle in Loggins and Messina. And here was this fresh face reaping accolades Loggins believed should have been his. Industry sources say Loggins felt erased, his grind dismissed, in favor of what he cynically called beginner's luck dressed up as genius. And when Cross's meteoric rise led to radio programmers shifting playlists and booking agents favoring the newer name, the silent war turned bitter. Loggins began snubbing Cross at industry events, avoiding shared appearances, and privately mocking him as a one-hit wonder with timing on his side. At a 1983 music conference, witnesses recall Loggins walking out before Cross's panel began, later brushing him off as someone who got lucky once. Cross, for his part, remained oblivious or perhaps willfully polite, often speaking highly of Loggins in interviews and even citing him as an influence. But admiration wasn't enough to thaw the ice. For Loggins, Cross represented everything wrong with the music industry's fleeting loyalty, a system that cheered novelty while discarding those who had paved the way. It was a rivalry that wasn't built on creative disagreement, but on the purest, rawest emotion of all: resentment, from a man who felt he'd earned the crown, only to watch it handed to someone else on a silver platter. Few partnerships in soft rock were as instantly magical, or ultimately as contentious, as the collaboration between Kenny Loggins and Michael McDonald. When they first joined forces in the late 1970s, their chemistry was undeniable. "This Is It" became an anthem, earning both critical praise and commercial success. But behind the scenes, the creative union began to sour, and the seeds of envy took root. Loggins, always the meticulous craftsman, prided himself on layered melodies, lyrical depth, and a style that leaned into subtle sophistication. But once McDonald's thunderous blue-eyed soul vocals entered the mix, the spotlight began to shift. What was supposed to be a partnership started feeling, to Loggins, more like a takeover. In private studio sessions, according to producer Ted Templeman, Loggins would grumble that McDonald's voice was so powerful it made him feel invisible on his own songs. "I'm becoming a backing musician on my own records," he reportedly snapped during one particularly tense session. The tension wasn't rooted in jealousy of talent. Loggins acknowledged McDonald's abilities, but in the overpowering nature of that talent. McDonald's vocal presence was like a tidal wave, and once it washed over a track, listeners remembered the voice, not the pen behind the lyrics. Loggins began to feel like his artistry was being consumed by his collaborators' charisma. As McDonald's solo career gained steam, using their joint work as a springboard, Loggins's discomfort turned to bitterness. He reportedly told friends, "I helped launch his solo career, and now he acts like he invented the sound we created together." The breaking point came at a 1984 music industry dinner, where witnesses say Loggins pointedly refused to sit at McDonald's table, choosing instead to dine with producers and executives who had no direct ties to his former partner. To the outside world, the two still maintained the image of creative allies, but insiders knew the truth. The camaraderie had been replaced by rivalry. McDonald, ever the diplomatic showman, continued to speak highly of Loggins in public, calling their work productive and magical. But the praise was one-sided. For Loggins, McDonald had become a symbol of the ultimate creative betrayal, a partner who used their shared foundation to elevate himself while leaving the other half in the shadows. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about identity. In Loggins' eyes, he was the architect, and McDonald was the loud tenant who got all the praise for living in the house he didn't build. And that's a resentment that no harmony could ever resolve. As the 1980s progressed, Kenny Loggins was already a household name, known for his rich harmonies and soft rock romanticism. But nothing prepared him for the meteoric solo success of Lionel Richie, a man who didn't just enter Loggins' lane, but took the wheel, sped off with the audience, and left a plume of glittering accolades in his wake. The tension between them wasn't immediate, but it brewed fast and hard when Richie's post-Commodore's career began dominating the love ballad charts with songs like Truly and Hello. These were the emotional ballads that Loggins had once monopolized, the territory he had so painstakingly cultivated through heartfelt lyricism and intimate acoustic arrangements. And now, they were being claimed by someone Loggins saw as a pop technician, a master of emotional manipulation masquerading as soul. According to sources close to the Motown scene, Loggins attended one of Richie's concerts in 1982 and left, fuming, later confiding to an industry executive, "He's taken my audience and my radio format. Those should be my love songs getting that reaction." What stung the most wasn't just Richie's success. It was his ability to transcend genres, race, and demographics, achieving a level of crossover adoration that made Loggins' chart wins feel provincial. In interviews, Loggins would throw subtle jabs, criticizing what he called calculated sentimentality in music, a clear dig at Richie's lush, orchestrated performances. He believed there was a stark difference between genuine romance and emotional theater, and in his mind, Richie represented the latter. The final straw may have come when both artists were shortlisted for the soundtrack of a major film in 1985. At a lavish Hollywood party, Loggins reportedly overheard producers discussing Richie as the fresh face of emotional music, and stormed out, later telling his team, "They want flash over substance now. Real craftsmanship doesn't matter anymore." Richie, for his part, never returned fire. In public, he called Loggins a smooth professional and claimed respect for his songwriting. But the compliment fell flat in the shadow of a bitter rivalry. To Loggins, Richie wasn't just competition. He was a shiny, emotionally glossy version of what Loggins believed he himself did with far more soul. It wasn't about race or style. It was about authenticity, about who got to own the mantle of romantic balladeer in a decade that valued commercial shine over emotional rawness. And in that silent battle for ballad supremacy, Loggins saw himself not just losing ground, but being written out of a story he helped begin. If there was one area Kenny Loggins thought he had locked down tighter than any soft rock peer, it was the movie soundtrack arena. From Footloose to I'm Alright and Danger Zone, Loggins wasn't just part of the pop culture conversation. He was the voice of it. His music defined cinematic moments, his choruses soared over silver screens, and for a while, Hollywood came to him first. But in 1984, that changed when a British drummer turned solo star named Phil Collins started dominating film soundtracks in ways that made Loggins feel like yesterday's news. Against All Odds wasn't just a hit. It was a statement that a new era had arrived. For Loggins, it felt like the ultimate betrayal from an industry he helped define. According to insiders, Loggins once fumed to a Columbia Pictures executive, "I built this soundtrack game and now some British guy is collecting all the prizes." The resentment wasn't purely nationalistic, but there was a clear sense that Loggins saw Collins' rise as an invasion into territory that had always been his. Collins, with his haunting voice and emotionally raw lyrics, offered a darker, more introspective contrast to Loggins' upbeat, energy-driven anthems, and producers, especially younger ones, found that fresh. They wanted that edge, that vulnerability, and they began phasing out Loggins in favor of Collins' moodier touch. At one point, both men were being considered for Top Gun's soundtrack, and when Collins' name came up in a studio meeting, sources say Loggins stood up and left, later stating, "I won't audition for projects in the field I created." To him, it wasn't just competition, it was erasure. While he had worked for years building relationships with directors and studios, Collins swept in, benefited from his accent appeal, and grabbed headlines Loggins believed were rightfully his. He referred to it privately as European, novelty, a phrase that hinted at both frustration and cultural snobbery. And though Collins publicly praised American songwriters and never expressed anything but admiration for Loggins, the damage was done. In the end, Loggins didn't just see Collins as a rival. He saw him as a threat to the legacy he had carefully crafted through years of disciplined, high-energy soundtrack work. In the Hollywood of the 80s, there wasn't room for two soundtrack kings. And for Loggins, being dethroned by a drummer from Genesis was more than a blow. It was a declaration that even the most loyal musical domains could be stolen overnight. In the glimmering world of soft rock, where image was just as vital as melody, Kenny Loggins had worked tirelessly to shape himself into the poster child of feel-good music. But no matter how many hits he scored or family-friendly tracks he produced, he couldn't eclipse the one artist who seemed to radiate purity without even trying: John Denver. Denver wasn't just popular, he was beloved. His environmental activism, humble demeanor, and crystal-clear vocals made him the musical embodiment of wholesomeness, a role Loggins desperately wanted to own. While Loggins polished his image through careful PR, management teams, and safe lyrical choices, Denver seemed to win America's heart just by showing up. According to RCA insiders, Loggins became obsessed with Denver's public appearances, often studying them with an almost clinical intensity, asking his team, "Why does he get to be America's sweetheart, and I'm just another pop guy?" The envy wasn't rooted in musical ability. Loggins knew he could write hits, but in public perception. No matter how hard he tried to present himself as the good guy of rock, Denver beat him at his own game. The tipping point came when both were vying for high-profile TV specials and family-friendly concert slots. Denver booked them effortlessly. Loggins, despite his catalog of clean, uplifting hits, found himself edged out by a man whose brand felt organic and effortless. "He makes virtue look so easy," Loggins once lamented after pulling out of a shared charity concert where he refused to follow Denver's set. He didn't want to be the act that came after America's moral compass. What haunted Loggins was Denver's authenticity, something he believed couldn't be faked, no matter how meticulously he tried. He once called Denver's appeal "natural goodness that can't be manufactured," a phrase that both admired and condemned. While Loggins played the part of the clean-cut superstar, Denver simply was. And for a man whose career was built on constructing the perfect vibe, nothing was more infuriating than seeing someone else do it better by just being themselves. In Loggins' view, Denver wasn't just a competitor. He was a reminder that image building only gets you so far when the public believes they've found the real deal. At the peak of his fame, Kenny Loggins was being played in every car radio, booming in stadiums, and booked across every major festival. But none of that could soothe the quiet ache he felt whenever James Taylor's name came up in music reviews. Because while Loggins was praised for hit-making and energy, Taylor was revered, called a poet, a storyteller, an artist in the truest sense. It wasn't about who sold more albums. It was about who critics took seriously. According to his former manager Irving Azoff, Loggins would pore over Taylor's glowing reviews, his voice laced with disbelief. "He gets called a poet while I get called a hitmaker. Why does my success make me less legitimate as an artist?" This wasn't just jealousy, it was identity crisis. Taylor's sparse, introspective style, his acoustic purity, and his lyrical depth earned him a place in the Songwriter Hall of Fame before Loggins could even crack the door. And that haunted Loggins. His songs were more complex, more produced, and arguably more versatile, but they didn't earn him the same level of cultural reverence. "Somehow his simple songs get treated like literature," Loggins once said, "while my arrangements get ignored as pop fluff." It was the harshest blow, being successful but never respected, being everywhere but still considered shallow. Taylor never responded in kind. In interviews, he praised Loggins' melodic talents, called his work sophisticated, and seemed unaware of the wound he represented. But for Loggins, Taylor wasn't just another folk singer. He was the unreachable benchmark, the gold standard of songwriter respectability that Loggins felt perpetually barred from. No award, no platinum certification, no chart-topping single could fill the void of not being taken seriously by the elite critics. Taylor had that legitimacy. Loggins, despite all he'd accomplished, never did. And for an artist who prided himself on evolution, craftsmanship, and emotional honesty, that cut deeper than any lost Grammy or overlooked soundtrack ever could. Kenny Loggins' story, for all its triumphs and pop culture triumphs, is ultimately a tale of duality. A man who gave the world some of its most memorable musical moments, while quietly wrestling with the demons of comparison, envy, and the crushing weight of legacy. On one side was the smiling performer with a guitar slung over his shoulder, churning out infectious hooks that defined an era. On the other, a fiercely ambitious craftsman haunted by the idea that he was always one step away from being forgotten, one Grammy short of validation, one headline shy of respect. His rivalries weren't always public, but they were deeply personal, shaped by a relentless drive to matter, not just to fans, but to the critics, the industry, and history itself. From the polished showmanship of Lionel Richie to the poetic simplicity of James Taylor, Loggins saw not just peers, but reflections of what he was not. And that tension fueled him, pushed him, and perhaps even broke him in moments when he felt invisible behind the curtain of softer, quieter admiration that others received so easily. The question now lingers in the air, long after the last chorus fades. Was Kenny Loggins protecting a legacy he built with his bare hands, or was he trapped in a cycle of jealousy that turned music into a battleground instead of a celebration? The answer may depend on which song you're listening to when you ask. But one thing's clear, behind every smooth note was a storm few ever saw coming.